What started as a routine winter hunt in the Oregon Territory of 1887 became the most dangerous rescue mission of Thomas Crow Feather's life, because the half-frozen girl he pulled from Devil's Mirror Lake turned out to be the missing daughter of the most ruthless railroad baron in America, a man who had spent 3 years and a fortune searching for her, and who would kill anyone who stood between him and getting her back. This is the story of how a Modoc scout's act of mercy ignited a war that would shake the foundations of the American frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut through the Cascade Mountains like a blade forged in hell, carrying with it the promise of a blizzard that would bury the Oregon Territory under 10 feet of snow before dawn. Thomas Crow Feather pulled his elk hide coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his paint horse along the treacherous ridge trail that overlooked Devil's Mirror Lake. The massive body of water stretched below him like a sheet of black glass, its surface frozen solid, except for the deadly patches where underground springs kept the ice thin and murderous. Thomas had been tracking a wounded elk for 2 days, following blood drops and broken branches through country so remote that even the most hardened trappers avoided it during winter. The Modoc had always known this land, every hidden trail, every safe crossing, every place where the earth itself seemed to breathe with ancient power. His grandfather had taught him to read the signs that others missed, to move through the wilderness like smoke, to survive where white men would die within hours. The elk's trail led down toward the lake's edge, and Thomas dismounted to study the tracks more carefully. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this frozen wasteland. A human scream, high and desperate, echoing across the ice like the cry of a lost soul. Thomas's head snapped up, his dark eyes scanning the lake's surface. For a moment, he saw nothing but endless white. Then, movement caught his attention near the lake's center, where the ice was thinnest. A figure thrashed in the dark water, arms flailing desperately as they tried to grab onto ice that kept breaking under their weight. Even from this distance, Thomas could see it was a woman, her long dark hair spread around her like ink in the water. She was wearing a heavy coat that was dragging her down, and hypothermia was already setting in. Her movements were becoming sluggish, uncoordinated. She had maybe 5 minutes before the cold claimed her forever. Thomas didn't hesitate. He'd seen too many people die in these mountains to waste time on careful consideration. He grabbed his rope from his saddle, tied one end around a sturdy pine tree, and began working his way down the steep embankment toward the lake. The slope was treacherous, covered in loose rocks and patches of ice that could send a man tumbling to his death. But Thomas moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had spent his entire life in country that tried to kill you just for existing. The woman's screams had stopped by the time he reached the shoreline. She was still moving, but barely, just weak paddling motions that were more reflex than conscious effort. Thomas could see that she'd fallen through in one of the worst possible spots, where a warm spring kept the ice honeycombed with hidden weak points. The solid ice was at least 30 feet away from where she struggled. Thomas tested the ice with his boot, feeling for the subtle differences in sound and give that would tell him where it was safe to step. The Modoc had been crossing frozen lakes for generations, and his grandfather had taught him the old techniques, how to distribute his weight, how to read the ice's color and texture, how to move quickly without creating vibrations that could cause a catastrophic break. He made it 20 feet before the ice began to groan ominously under his weight. The woman had stopped moving entirely now, floating face up with only her nose and mouth above water. Her lips were blue, her eyes closed. Thomas realized with growing desperation that he couldn't reach her by walking on the ice. It would never hold his weight that far out. That's when he made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. Thomas shrugged out of his heavy coat and boots, keeping only his knife and the rope. The air temperature was well below zero, and the shock of cold hit him like a physical blow as he lowered himself into the water at the ice's edge. The cold was beyond anything most people could imagine. A crushing, paralyzing force that drove the breath from his lungs and made his muscles seize up instantly. But Thomas had trained for this, had spent winters deliberately exposing himself to cold water to build his tolerance. It was an old Modoc practice, one that had saved his life more than once during military campaigns when crossing frozen rivers. Was the difference between completing a mission and dying in the wilderness. He forced his limbs to move, pulling himself through the water toward the unconscious woman. The broken ice cut at his skin like razors, and he could feel his core temperature dropping rapidly. He had maybe 3 minutes before his own body would shut down from hypothermia. Thomas reached the woman just as she began to slip beneath the surface. He grabbed her coat with one hand and hooked his other arm around her chest, then began the desperate struggle back toward shore. She was dead weight now, unconscious and waterlogged, and the heavy fabric of her expensive dress was like an anchor trying to drag them both down. The swim back was a nightmare of cold and exhaustion. Thomas's limbs felt like lead, and ice crystals were forming in his hair and eyebrows. Several times he had to break through thin ice that had already begun forming in their wake. His vision started to tunnel, and he knew he was approaching the limits of what his body could endure. But Thomas Crow Feather had survived cavalry charges, grizzly bear attacks, and 3 separate attempts by rival tribes to kill him. He'd spent 2 years as a scout for the U.S. Army before deserting when he realized they were using his knowledge to hunt down and slaughter innocent native families. If there was one thing Thomas knew how to do, it was refuse to quit when quitting meant death. He made it to the shore through sheer force of will, hauling the unconscious woman up onto the rocky beach before collapsing beside her. For a moment, he lay there gasping, his body shaking so violently he couldn't control it. Then training kicked in, and he forced himself to move. The woman wasn't breathing. Her skin was grey-white, and when Thomas pressed his ear to her chest, he could barely detect a heartbeat. He'd seen enough drowning victims to know what needed to be done. He rolled her onto her side and pressed hard on her back, forcing water from her lungs. Then he began the rhythmic chest compressions his grandfather had taught him, an ancient technique for reviving the drowned that white doctors were only beginning to understand. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the woman suddenly convulsed and began coughing up lake water. Her eyes fluttered open, startling blue eyes that seemed too bright for her pale face. She stared up at Thomas without comprehension, her lips moving but making no sound. Thomas knew they were both still in mortal danger. They were soaked through in sub-zero temperatures, miles from any shelter, with a blizzard approaching. He gathered the woman in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, he realized, far too thin for someone who should have been healthy, and began the grueling climb back up the embankment to where his horse waited. His emergency shelter was a 15-minute ride through country that would challenge an experienced rider in good weather. With an unconscious woman and his own body fighting hypothermia, it became an epic struggle just to stay in the saddle. Thomas wrapped them both in his elk-hide coat and pressed the paint horse as hard as he dared on the treacherous trail. The shelter was a cave he'd discovered years ago, deep enough to provide protection from wind and snow, with a narrow entrance that would hold heat. More importantly, he'd cached supplies here: dry firewood, extra blankets, and emergency food. Thomas had learned long ago that preparation was the difference between survival and becoming another skeleton found in the spring thaw. He got the fire started with hands that shook so badly he could barely strike flint to steel. The woman was unconscious again, her breathing shallow and irregular. Thomas knew that getting her warm was critical, but it had to be done carefully. Warming someone too quickly after severe hypothermia could stop their heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. He stripped off her wet clothes, without ceremony or embarrassment. This was about survival, not modesty. Her dress was expensive, silk and fine wool that would have cost more than most people earned in a year. Underneath, she wore a corset and undergarments that spoke of wealth and privilege. But what caught Thomas's attention was something else entirely. Old scars on her wrists and ankles, marks that looked like they'd been made by shackles or ropes. Thomas wrapped her in dry blankets and positioned her near the fire, then saw to his own condition. His fingers and toes were white with frostbite, and he spent painful minutes warming them back to life. As feeling returned, he began to process what had happened. Who was this woman, and what was she doing alone at Devil's Mirror Lake in the middle of winter? The nearest settlement was 40 miles away, and the trail down to the lake wasn't something you stumbled onto by accident. She'd been dressed for travel, but not for wilderness survival. Her boots were fashionable, but impractical. Her coat warm, but not designed for extended exposure to harsh conditions. Most puzzling of all were those scars. Thomas had seen similar marks on escaped slaves and prisoners of war. Someone had kept this woman chained up, and recently enough that the marks were still visible. As the cave warmed and color slowly returned to the woman's face, Thomas studied her more carefully. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with features that suggested mixed heritage. Her bone structure had the classical beauty of European ancestry, but her skin tone and the texture of her hair suggested native blood as well. In the Oregon Territory, such mixing was common enough, but it also created its own complications. She stirred as full consciousness returned, her blue eyes opening to stare around the cave with growing awareness. When her gaze fell on Thomas, sitting cross-legged by the fire, with his long black hair loose around his shoulders, she recoiled instinctively. "Easy," Thomas said in English, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "You're safe. You fell. Through the ice. Do you remember?" The woman tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Thomas handed her a tin cup of warm water, watching as she drank it in small, careful sips. When she found her voice, her first words surprised him. "You're Modoc." It wasn't a question, and there was no fear in her tone, just curiosity and something that might have been relief. "Thomas Crow Feather," he replied. "And you are?" She hesitated, and Thomas saw something flicker behind her eyes. Calculation, maybe even fear. My name is Sarah Whitebird." Thomas knew she was lying. The name was obviously improvised, and her slight hesitation before speaking suggested she was choosing her words carefully. But he'd learned long ago that people had their reasons for concealing their identities, especially in the lawless Oregon Territory. "How did you end up in the lake, Sarah Whitebird?" This time the hesitation was longer. "I was, traveling. My horse threw me. I tried to cross the ice to get back to the trail, but it gave way." Another lie, and not even a particularly good one. Thomas had seen no sign of a horse anywhere near the lake, and her expensive clothes weren't riding gear. More importantly, no one traveled alone through this country in winter unless they were running from something or someone. But Thomas didn't press. He'd been a fugitive himself once, and he understood the need for secrets. Instead, he handed her a piece of dried venison and watched as she ate it with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen food in days. "Storm's coming," Thomas said, nodding toward the cave entrance where snow was already beginning to fall. "We'll be here for at least 2 days, maybe 3. You need to get your strength back." Sarah, if that was really her name, nodded and pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving me. I know you risked your life. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said with a bitter laugh. They really wouldn't have. Thomas heard something in her voice, a deep cynicism that seemed too old for her years. Whatever had put those scars on her wrists had also left marks on her soul. As night fell and the blizzard intensified outside, Thomas found himself studying his unexpected companion more carefully. There was something about her that didn't add up. Her hands were soft, but showed recent calluses from hard work. Her speech patterns suggested education and refinement, but she ate like someone who'd known real hunger. Most intriguingly, she moved with a careful precision that reminded Thomas of caged animals who'd learned to be constantly alert for danger. Sarah seemed equally interested in him, though she tried to hide it. Thomas caught her watching him as he tended the fire, her blue eyes taking in details with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing everything about him. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something different. The stories. I heard about the Modoc." She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Thomas knew what stories she meant. The Modoc War had ended only 14 years ago, but the newspapers were still full of sensationalized accounts of savage warriors and bloodthirsty raids. The fact that the Modoc had been fighting to defend their ancestral lands from white settlers who'd broken treaty after treaty was conveniently forgotten in most tellings. "What stories?" Thomas asked. Sarah looked down at her hands. "That you were all. Who killers? That you couldn't be trusted, that you—" She stopped herself. "That we what? That you took captives, white women, kept them as slaves." Thomas felt a familiar surge of anger at the casual racism, but he kept his voice level. "And what do you think now?" Sarah met his eyes directly. "I think that if you were the kind of man those stories described, I'd already be dead. Or worse." There was something in the way she said it that made Thomas wonder again about those scars. Someone had hurt this woman, and badly. The question was who, and whether they were still looking for her. The storm raged for 3 days, just as Thomas had predicted. During that time, Sarah slowly recovered her strength, though she remained guarded about her past. Thomas shared his emergency food supplies and made sure she stayed warm, but he also watched her carefully. There was something about her story that didn't ring true, and his survival instincts were telling him that this mysterious woman might be more dangerous than she appeared. On the second day, as Sarah sat by the fire mending her torn dress with needle and thread from Thomas's pack, she suddenly looked up at him with those startling blue eyes. "Why did you save me?" she asked. "You don't know me. For all you knew, I could have been dangerous." Thomas considered the question. "My grandfather once told me that the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching, but what he does when no one will ever know. There was no one at that lake but you, me, and the spirits of the mountains. I saved you because it was the right thing to do." Sarah stared at him for a long moment. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was. He also taught me to trust. My instincts about people. And my instincts tell me you're not who you say you are." Sarah's hands stilled on her mending. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Sarah Whitebird is a name you made up 3 days ago. I mean that someone with your education and refinement doesn't end up alone in the wilderness without a very good reason. And I mean that those scars on your wrists tell a story you're not ready to share." For a moment, Thomas thought she might tell him the truth. He could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, the desire to trust warring with ingrained caution. But then she looked away and resumed her mending. "Maybe when this storm passes," she said quietly, "maybe then I'll tell you who I really am." But Thomas had a feeling that when the storm passed, their real troubles would just be beginning. The third morning, Thomas woke to silence. The howling wind had stopped, and pale sunlight was filtering through the cave entrance. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine, beautiful, and deadly in equal measure. Sarah was already awake, sitting by the dying fire and staring out at the transformed landscape. She'd braided her long, dark hair and somehow managed to make her torn dress look presentable again, but there was tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. "Time to go," Thomas said, beginning to pack their few belongings. Sarah nodded, but didn't move. "Thomas," she said finally, "when we leave here, where will you take me?" It was a strange question. "Where do you want to go?" "I don't know. Somewhere safe. Somewhere they won't find me." "Who won't find you, Sarah?" She was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "The men my father sent to bring me home." And with those words, Thomas realized that saving this mysterious woman from the frozen lake was about to become the most dangerous mistake of his life. The journey down from the cave should have been peaceful. Fresh snow crunched beneath their horses' hooves as Thomas led the way along a narrow deer trail that wound through towering pines. The morning sun cast everything in brilliant white and deep blue shadows, creating a winter wonderland that would have been breathtaking under normal circumstances. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Sarah, or whatever her real name was, rode behind him on his spare horse, a sturdy bay mare he'd acquired from a trader the previous autumn. She sat the saddle well, with the easy confidence of someone who'd been riding since childhood, another detail that didn't fit with her story of being a simple traveler. Poor people didn't learn to ride like aristocrats. Thomas had chosen this route carefully. It would take them toward the settlement of Pine Ridge, a rough frontier town where Sarah could find shelter and transportation to wherever she wanted to go. But more importantly, it avoided the main trails, where they might encounter other travelers. Thomas's instincts were screaming that Sarah was in real danger, and he wanted to keep her hidden until he understood what they were really dealing with. They'd been riding for 2 hours when Thomas heard it, the distant sound of horses moving fast through the forest. He raised his hand, signaling Sarah to stop, and listened intently. At least 6 riders, maybe more, and they were moving with purpose rather than simply traveling. These weren't trappers or settlers going about their business. These were men. "On a hunt! Get down!" Thomas whispered, dismounting quickly. "Lead your horse into those trees." Sarah didn't argue, which told Thomas she'd been expecting this. They concealed themselves and their mounts behind a thick stand of Douglas fir, just as a group of riders came into view on the main trail below. Thomas counted 8 men, all well armed, and dressed in the kind of practical but expensive gear that marked them as professional hired guns. The leader was a tall man with a carefully trimmed beard and a wool coat that probably cost more than most people's houses. He carried himself with military bearing, and when he spoke to his men, Thomas could hear the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Spread out," the leader commanded. "Check every cabin, every cave, every place. Someone might take shelter. The girl's injured and she can't have gone far. Remember, Mr. Vanderbilt wants her brought back alive and unharmed." Thomas felt Sarah stiffen beside him at the mention of that name, Vanderbilt, one of the most powerful railroad barons in America, a man whose influence stretched from New York to California. If this girl was connected to Cornelius Vanderbilt, then Thomas had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple rescue. One of the riders, a younger man with cruel eyes and a scar running down his left cheek, spoke up. "What if she's with someone? What if some local took her in?" The leader's expression hardened. "Then that someone disappears. Permanently." Mr. Vanderbilt was very clear. No witnesses, no complications. We bring back his daughter and we eliminate anyone who might have seen her. Sarah's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Thomas had already suspected. She wasn't just connected to the Vanderbilt fortune. She was family. And these men weren't just looking for her. They were planning to kill anyone who'd helped her. The riders continued down the trail, their voices fading as they moved toward Pine Ridge. Thomas waited until he was certain they were gone before turning to Sarah. Her face was pale, but there was something else in her expression now, a mixture of fear and desperate determination. "Time for the truth," Thomas said quietly. "Who are you really?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. When she opened them again, the calculated caution was gone. In its place was a young woman who looked exhausted by the weight of secrets. "My name is Margaret Vanderbilt," she said. "And yes, before you ask, Cornelius Vanderbilt is my father. He's also the man I've been running from for 3 years." Thomas had heard stories about Cornelius Vanderbilt, how he'd built a railroad empire through ruthless business practices and political corruption, how he'd crushed competitors and driven small farmers off their land to make way for his tracks. But he'd never heard anything about a daughter who'd disappeared. "Why are you running from your own father?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Because he's not my father, not the way that matters. He's a monster who thinks he owns everything and everyone, including me." She paused, staring off into the distance, as if seeing something Thomas couldn't. "My mother was Lakota Sioux. She worked as a translator for one of his railroad survey crews. When she became pregnant with me, Vanderbilt married her. Not because he loved her, but because he wanted to legitimize his claim to native lands through his half-breed daughter." Thomas understood immediately. Marriage to a native woman, even one as brief and calculating as Margaret described, would give Vanderbilt legal standing to claim tribal territories. It was a strategy that had been used across the frontier, though rarely by someone of Vanderbilt's stature. "What happened to your mother?" "She died when I was 8. An accident, according to the official reports. But I heard the servants talking. She'd been threatening to expose some of his business dealings, and then suddenly she fell down the stairs." Margaret's voice was flat, emotionless. "After that, I became his property. He kept me locked up in boarding schools and private estates, brought me out only when he needed to show off his reformed, savage daughter to potential business partners." Thomas was beginning to understand the scars on her wrists. "You tried to escape before. Many times. He had me chained to my bed for 6 months after the 3rd attempt. Said it was for my own protection, that I was mentally unstable and might hurt myself." Margaret touched her wrists unconsciously. "The last time I tried 3 years ago, I made it all the way to San Francisco before his men caught me. He had me committed to a private asylum. The pieces were falling into place now, and you escaped from there. 2 weeks ago. I had help, a Paiute woman who worked in the kitchens. She'd heard my mother's name mentioned by some of the older staff, knew the story of what Vanderbilt had done. She helped me get out, gave me money and clothes, told me to head north where the railroad's influence was weaker." Thomas processed this information quickly. If Margaret had escaped 2 weeks ago and those riders were just now reaching Oregon territory, it meant she'd covered an incredible amount of ground. It also meant that Vanderbilt's resources were vast enough to track her across multiple states. "Why Devil's Mirror Lake?" Thomas asked. "That's not exactly on the way to anywhere." Margaret looked embarrassed. "I was following what I thought was a game trail. I'd run out of food 2 days earlier, and I was getting desperate. When I saw the lake, I thought maybe there would be a settlement nearby. I was trying to cross the ice to get to the other side. When it gave way, you would have died if I hadn't found you." "I know." Margaret met his eyes directly. "And now you're going to die because you saved me. That's what those men do. They eliminate loose ends. I'm sorry, Thomas. I never meant for anyone else to get hurt." Thomas considered their situation. 8 professional killers with unlimited resources, hunting through country where there were few places to hide and fewer people willing to risk. Vanderbilt's wrath by helping them. Most men would have cut their losses, turned Margaret over to her father's men, and hoped to be left alone. But Thomas Crow Feather wasn't most men. "How badly does your father want you back?" he asked. "Badly. Enough to spend a fortune hunting me." I'm his only heir, and I represent his claim to millions of acres of tribal land. Without me, he can't legitimize his seizure of native territories. And if something happened to you? If you died? Margaret's smile was grim. Then he'd lose everything. He's built in the West. The government's already getting pressure from Washington about his land deals. Without his native daughter to provide legal cover, Congress might actually investigate his operations. Thomas made his decision. Then, we make sure you stay alive, but we're not running anymore. Margaret stared at him. What do you mean? I mean your father's men are expecting a frightened girl trying to hide in the wilderness. They're not expecting a fight. Thomas began checking his weapons, a rifle, a pistol, and the wickedly sharp knife his grandfather had given him. How much do you know about your father's business operations in Oregon? Quite a bit. He used to make me memorize details about his various properties and investments. Said it was part of my education as his heir. Good, because we're going to use that knowledge against him. Thomas outlined his plan as they rode deeper into the mountains, avoiding main trails and settlements. Instead of fleeing, they would go on the offensive. Margaret knew the locations of her father's timber camps, mining operations, and railroad construction sites. More importantly, she knew which operations were illegal or quasi-legal, conducted without proper permits or on disputed land. There's a logging camp about 20 miles from here, Margaret explained as they made camp that evening in a hidden canyon. It's on Warm Springs reservation land, but Vanderbilt's been bribing local officials to look the other way. If word got out about what he's doing there, it would create exactly the kind of scandal that might bring federal investigators, Thomas finished. And while your father's dealing with that crisis, we disappear. They spent the evening planning their approach. Margaret drew detailed maps in the dirt, showing Thomas the layout of the logging camp and the location of the main office where records would be kept. Thomas studied the terrain, identifying escape routes and defensive positions, but as they talked, Thomas found himself watching Margaret with growing respect. The frightened girl he'd pulled from the lake was gone, replaced by someone with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. Whatever else Cornelius Vanderbilt had done to his daughter, he'd inadvertently created a formidable enemy. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked suddenly. "You could turn me over to those men and probably get a reward. Instead, you're risking your life to fight one of the most powerful men in America." Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. 15 years ago, I was a scout for the U.S. Army. I thought I was serving my country, helping to bring peace to the frontier. Instead, I was leading soldiers to Modoc villages so they could massacre women and children. He paused, the memories still painful after all these years. There was one village, Wokus Bay. I led a cavalry company there because the commanding officer said we were going to negotiate a new treaty. Instead, they slaughtered everyone, 43 people, including 16 children. Margaret was silent, understanding that Thomas was sharing something he rarely talked about. "I deserted that night," Thomas continued. "Walked away from the army, from my pay, from everything. I've spent the last 15 years trying to live with what I helped make happen. Maybe helping you won't balance those scales, but it's a start. You didn't know what they were planning." "No, but I should have. I should have seen the signs, should have questioned orders that didn't make sense. I was so eager to prove that a Modoc could serve alongside white soldiers that I ignored my instincts." Thomas looked at Margaret directly. "I'm not making that mistake again. Your father is a predator, and predators need to be stopped." They set out before dawn, using game trails and hunters' paths that wouldn't appear on any map. Thomas had decided to approach the logging camp from the east, where the terrain was roughest, but also provided the best cover. It would be a difficult journey, but it would also keep them away from the main search parties. As they rode through the pre-dawn darkness, Margaret found herself studying her unlikely protector. Thomas moved through the wilderness with an ease that spoke of deep familiarity, reading signs in broken branches and disturbed earth that were invisible to her. His dark eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger, but it was more than just woodcraft that impressed her. Thomas carried himself with a quiet dignity that reminded Margaret of her mother's stories about Lakota warriors. There was no bluster or false bravado, just calm competence and an unshakable sense of purpose. "Thomas," Margaret said as they paused to rest the horses, "what will you do after this is over? Assuming we survive, I mean." "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Well, when you do, I want you to know that you'll always have a friend. If I reclaim my inheritance, if I can somehow take control of my father's empire, there will be a place for you." Thomas smiled slightly. "Planning to reform the Vanderbilt Railroad, are you? Planning to tear it down and build something better? Something that doesn't require stealing land from native tribes or murdering anyone who gets in the way?" There was such fierce determination in her voice that Thomas almost believed she could do it. Margaret Vanderbilt might have been raised as a prisoner, but she had the iron will of both her parents, her mother's courage and her father's relentless drive, but tempered with a conscience he'd never possessed. They reached the ridge overlooking the logging camp just as the sun was setting. Below them, perhaps 50 men were ending their workday, gathering around cook fires and heading toward a collection of rough cabins. The operation was larger than Thomas had expected. Dozens of massive tree stumps showed where old-growth forest had been clear-cut, and a temporary rail line had been built to carry lumber to the main railroad. "There," Margaret pointed to a slightly larger building set apart from the workers' quarters. "That's the main office. The records will be kept there, along with the payroll and correspondence with my father's people." Thomas studied the layout carefully. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter, but they looked bored and complacent. Most of the workers would be eating dinner or drinking in their cabins. If they moved quickly and quietly, they could be in and out before anyone realized what was happening. "What exactly are we looking for?" Thomas asked. "Evidence of the bribes to local officials. Correspondence about the illegal land seizure. Anything that proves this operation violates federal law." Margaret's voice was grim. "My father's usually careful about written records, but this is a remote operation. They might have gotten sloppy." They waited until full darkness before making their move. Thomas left the horses hidden in a stand of trees and led Margaret down toward the camp. They moved like shadows, using the natural contours of the land to stay invisible. Thomas's military training had included infiltration techniques, and Margaret proved surprisingly adept at following his lead. The office building was locked, but Thomas made quick work of the simple mechanism with his knife. Inside, they found a treasure trove of incriminating documents. Payroll records showing payments to county officials, correspondence with territorial administrators discussing arrangements for land use permits. Most damning of all, a letter from Cornelius Vanderbilt himself, explicitly ordering the illegal logging operation to continue despite federal warnings. "This is it," Margaret whispered, gathering the most important documents. "This is enough to bring federal investigators and probably criminal charges." But as they prepared to leave, Thomas heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of multiple horses approaching the camp at a gallop. Through the office window he could see torches moving between the trees. Margaret's father's men had found them. "How many ways out of this building?" Thomas asked quickly. 2. The front door and a window in the back room. Thomas moved to the front window and peered out carefully. At least a dozen riders had surrounded the office building, and more were spreading out to search the workers' quarters. The leader with the trimmed beard was directing the operation, pointing men toward different positions. "They know we're here," Thomas realized. "Someone must have seen us." Margaret's face was pale but determined. The documents. We can't let them get these back. Thomas made a quick decision. Give me the papers. I'll create a distraction. Draw them away. You get out the back window and head for the horses. I'm not leaving you. You are if you want those documents to reach federal authorities. This is bigger than both of us now. Before Margaret could argue further, a voice called out from outside, the leader of the hunting party. Miss Vanderbilt, we know you're in. There, your father just wants you to come home. No one needs to get hurt. Thomas knew it was a lie. These men had orders to eliminate witnesses, which meant both he and Margaret were marked for death. But the fact that they were trying negotiation first suggested they wanted to take Margaret alive if possible. What's your name? Margaret called back. Captain Harrison. I work for your father's security division. Well, Captain Harrison, you can tell my father that I'm never coming home. And if he wants me, he'll have to come and get me himself. There was a pause. Then Harrison's voice again, harder now. Miss Vanderbilt, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Come out now and we'll discuss terms. Thomas was already moving, gathering the most important documents and stuffing them into his coat. He caught Margaret's eye and nodded toward the back room. She hesitated for a moment, then kissed him quickly on the cheek. Don't die, Thomas Crowfeather. The world needs more men like you. Then she was gone, slipping out the back window like smoke. Thomas waited until he was sure she'd had time to reach the tree line, then made his own move. But instead of running, he did something that Captain Harrison would never expect. Thomas Crowfeather walked out the front door with his hands raised, a fierce smile on his face. Gentlemen, he said calmly, I believe you're looking for me. Captain Harrison stared at the Modoc warrior who had just walked out of the office building with his hands raised, and immediately knew something was wrong. In 20 years of tracking fugitives and eliminating problems for powerful men, Harrison had developed instincts that kept him alive. Those instincts were screaming that this was a trap. Where's the girl? Harrison demanded, his rifle trained on Thomas's chest. Thomas smiled, an expression that didn't reach his dark eyes. What girl? One of Harrison's men, a nervous young tracker named Collins, stepped forward. Captain, there were definitely 2 sets of tracks leading into the camp. Fresh ones. Search the building, Harrison ordered. Williams, take 3 men and circle the perimeter. If she's running, she can't have gotten far. But Thomas knew that Margaret was already gone, using the confusion of his surrender to slip away into the forest she'd learned to navigate during their journey together. The documents that could destroy her father's Western operations were safely hidden in his coat, and now all he had to do was buy her enough time to reach the nearest federal marshal. Of course, staying alive long enough to see that happen was going to be the challenging part. Harrison's men returned from their search empty-handed, their faces grim. The captain's jaw tightened as he processed this information. A half-frozen girl couldn't simply vanish in terrain his professional trackers knew intimately, which meant she'd had help from someone with exceptional woodcraft skills. You're the one who's been helping her, Harrison said, studying Thomas more carefully. The question is why? What's a Modoc doing mixed up with Cornelius Vanderbilt's family problems? Maybe I don't like seeing women mistreated, Thomas replied calmly. Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. A noble savage with a conscience. How refreshing. He signaled to 2 of his men. Tie him up. We'll take him back to camp and see how talkative he becomes after a few hours with Rodriguez. Thomas had heard of Rodriguez, a former army interrogator who'd been cashiered for his creative interpretation of prisoner treatment regulations. The man's reputation for extracting information through pain was legendary throughout the Western territories. As Harrison's men approached with rope, Thomas made his decision. His hands weren't really raised in surrender. They were positioned to strike. When the first man reached for him, Thomas grabbed the man's rifle barrel and used it as a lever to slam the stock into the second man's face. The first tracker stumbled backward, and Thomas spun the rifle around to point it at Harrison. For a moment, The clearing was frozen in tension. Thomas held a rifle on the captain, while 11 other guns were trained on him. It was a Mexican standoff that could only end one way, but Thomas wasn't planning to go down without a fight. "You're outnumbered," Harrison said calmly. "Surrender now, and I promise your death will be quick." "I've got a better idea," Thomas replied. "You let me walk away, and I don't tell the federal marshals about your illegal logging operation." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about our operations?" "I know you're cutting timber on Warm Springs Reservation land without permits. I know you've been bribing county officials to look the other way. And I know that's just the beginning of what Cornelius Vanderbilt is doing out here." The captain's face remained impassive, but Thomas saw the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he'd hit close to home. Harrison was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about retrieving a runaway daughter. It was about protecting a vast criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple territories. "Kill him!" Harrison ordered. Thomas was already moving when the order came. He dove behind a stack of lumber as rifles cracked around him, splinters flying as bullets chewed into the wood. He rolled to his left, came up behind a loading cart, and fired once. One of Harrison's men dropped with a scream, clutching his shoulder. The problem was that Thomas had one rifle with limited ammunition against 11 men with plenty of bullets and no concern about property damage. This wasn't a fight he could win through direct confrontation, but Thomas Crow Feather hadn't survived 15 years as a fugitive by fighting fair. He spotted a kerosene lantern hanging from a post near the office building. One well-placed shot sent it crashing to the ground in a burst of flame that immediately began spreading to the scattered wood chips and sawdust that covered the area. Within seconds, the entire logging camp was bathed in flickering orange light. "Spread out," Harrison shouted over the growing roar of flames. "Don't let him reach the tree line." But the fire was creating exactly the chaos Thomas needed. Workers were emerging from their cabins, shouting and running in confusion. Some tried to organize bucket brigades to save equipment, while others simply fled. In the midst of this pandemonium, a single figure moving through the shadows became almost impossible to track. Thomas used the confusion to work his way toward the edge of camp, staying low and using buildings for cover. He was almost to the tree line when he heard Harrison's voice rising above the noise. $50 to the man who brings me that Indian scalp. 100 if you take him alive." The offer was enough to galvanize Harrison's men and turn some of the camp workers into additional hunters. Suddenly, Thomas wasn't just facing 11 professional killers. He was being hunted by anyone desperate enough to want that bounty money. Thomas reached the forest and immediately began using every evasion technique his grandfather had taught him. He moved from tree to tree, careful not to break branches or leave obvious tracks. When possible, he used rocky ground or fallen logs to mask his passage. Most importantly, he began leading his pursuers away from the direction Margaret had taken. For the next 3 hours, Thomas played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the mountain forest. His hunters had numbers and equipment, but Thomas knew the country intimately. He led them through the most difficult terrain he could find. Steep ravines, thick underbrush, rocky slopes where a careless step could mean a broken ankle. Twice, he circled back on his own trail, using his pursuers' eagerness against them. When a group of 3 trackers got separated from the main party, Thomas eliminated them quietly with his knife, taking their ammunition and supplies. When 2 more got lost trying to follow a false trail he'd laid, he simply disappeared, leaving them to stumble around in the darkness. By midnight, Harrison had lost 5 men and was no closer to capturing his quarry than when the chase began. Worse, the fire at the logging camp had destroyed most of the records and equipment, turning what should have been a simple retrieval mission into a complete disaster. But Thomas's real objective wasn't just to escape. It was to buy Margaret enough time to reach help and expose her father's operations. That meant staying close enough to keep Harrison's attention focused on the hunt while avoiding capture, long enough for federal authorities to act on the information Margaret carried. Thomas found the perfect position on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the main trail between the logging camp and the nearest town. From here, he could see anyone moving in either direction, and the terrain was defensible enough that even a large force would have trouble dislodging him. As dawn broke over the mountains, Thomas watched Harrison reorganizing his remaining men in the valley below. The captain was clearly frustrated. His careful plan had unraveled, his men were demoralized, and his primary objective was somewhere in the wind, with evidence that could destroy the Vanderbilt Empire. Thomas was studying the scene through a pair of field glasses he'd taken from one of Harrison's men when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A new group of riders was approaching the camp, 12 men in military-style uniforms, led by a figure Thomas recognized from newspaper photographs. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself had come to Oregon Territory. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the force of personality that had built a railroad empire. Vanderbilt sat his horse with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute obedience, and when he began speaking to Harrison, every person in the camp stopped what they were doing to listen. Thomas couldn't hear the conversation, but he could guess its content from Harrison's increasingly defensive posture. The captain was explaining how a simple retrieval had turned into a running battle with a Modoc warrior who seemed to anticipate their every move. After several minutes of heated discussion, Vanderbilt gestured toward the mountains. Fresh orders were being given, and Thomas watched as the assembled men began organizing into smaller hunting parties with military precision. Whatever resources Harrison had been working with, Vanderbilt had just doubled them, but Thomas also noticed something else that gave him hope. One of Vanderbilt's men was riding hard back toward town, carrying what looked like urgent dispatches. If Margaret had reached federal authorities, those messages might be orders to cover up or destroy evidence of illegal activities, which meant the pressure was working. Thomas settled in to wait and watch, but his vigil was interrupted by the sound of someone moving through the rocks behind him. He spun around, rifle ready, expecting to face one of Harrison's trackers who'd managed to work around behind his position. Instead, he found himself looking at Margaret Vanderbilt. She was dressed in clothes she'd somehow acquired during her escape, practical, frontier garb that replaced her torn dress. Her long, dark hair was bound back in a severe braid, and she carried a rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. "What are you doing here?" Thomas demanded in a whisper. "You should be halfway to the territorial capital." "By now, I was," Margaret replied, settling into cover beside him, "but I ran into some interesting people on the way." She gestured toward a stand of trees on the opposite ridge, and Thomas saw them, at least 20 men in the blue uniforms of federal marshals, along with what looked like a full company of U.S. Army cavalry. Margaret's evidence had reached the right people, and the government was finally ready to act against Cornelius Vanderbilt's illegal operations. "They've been tracking my father's activities for months," Margaret explained. "The documents we found were exactly what they needed to move against him. Marshal Crawford says they have enough evidence to bring federal charges for land fraud, bribery, and conspiracy." Thomas felt a surge of hope, but he also recognized the tactical situation. Vanderbilt's men were caught between the federal forces and the difficult mountain terrain, but that also meant they were desperate. Desperate men with nothing to lose were the most dangerous kind. "What's the plan?" Thomas asked. "The marshals want to take him alive if possible. A trial would expose the full scope of his operations and implicate his political allies, but they also know he won't surrender easily." As if summoned by their conversation, a voice echoed across the valley below. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself. using a speaking trumpet to address the mountains where he knew his daughter was hiding. "Margaret, I know you're out there, and I know you can hear me. This has gone far enough. You're my daughter, my blood, my legacy. Come home where you belong, and we can put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us." The voice was cultured, reasonable, the tone of a loving father concerned for his wayward child. But Thomas could hear the steel underneath, the absolute certainty of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. Margaret cupped her hands around her mouth and called back, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "I am not your daughter. I am not your property, and I am not coming home." The response was immediate and violent. Vanderbilt's men opened fire on the general area where Margaret's voice had originated, bullets whining off rocks and splintering. "Trees." The message was clear. If Cornelius Vanderbilt couldn't have his daughter back, he was prepared to eliminate her rather than let her testify against him. Thomas grabbed Margaret and pulled her deeper into the rocks as rifle fire intensified. "So much for paternal affection," he muttered. "He never loved me," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "I was always just an asset to him, a way to legitimize his theft of native lands. Now that I'm threatening his empire instead of supporting it, I'm just another problem to be solved." The firing stopped abruptly, and Thomas risked a look at the valley below. Vanderbilt's men were spreading out, beginning a systematic advance up the mountainside, but they were also moving into a trap the federal marshals were positioning themselves to cut off escape routes while the cavalry prepared to block the main trails. "This is going to get very ugly very quickly," Thomas observed. Margaret was checking her rifle, her face set with grim determination. "Good. It's time my father learned that actions have consequences." The battle that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced even during his military service. It wasn't the organized chaos of a cavalry charge or the desperate fury of a last stand. Instead, it was a complex three-way engagement fought across difficult mountain terrain between forces with conflicting objectives. Vanderbilt's men were trying to reach Margaret while fighting their way through federal officers who wanted to take them alive. The marshals were attempting to arrest dangerous criminals without letting them escape or harm their primary witness. And in the middle of it all, Thomas and Margaret were simply trying to survive long enough for justice to prevail. Thomas found himself fighting alongside federal marshals for the first time in his life. A strange experience for someone who'd spent years avoiding government authority. But Marshal Crawford proved to be a competent leader who understood that defeating Vanderbilt was more important than settling old scores with deserters or fugitives. The turning point came when one of Vanderbilt's men, a demolitions expert named Baker, attempted to use dynamite to clear a path through the rocks where Margaret was hidden. The explosion brought down half the mountainside, but it also created an avalanche that trapped Vanderbilt himself in the valley below. When the dust settled, Cornelius Vanderbilt found himself surrounded by federal marshals with nowhere to run and no men left to fight for him. His carefully constructed empire had crumbled in a matter of hours, brought down by the daughter he'd tried to use as a tool. Thomas and Margaret made their way down to where the railroad baron sat in federal custody, his expensive clothes torn and dirty, his face a mask of impotent rage. When he saw his daughter approaching, his expression shifted to something that might have been hope. "Margaret," he said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he'd used to build his fortune, "you're still my heir. Whatever differences we've had, we can work them out. The Vanderbilt name means something in this country." Margaret looked down at the man who had murdered her mother, imprisoned her for years, and tried to have her killed, rather than lose control of his stolen empire. When she spoke, her voice was calm and final. "The Vanderbilt name means theft, murder, and corruption, and after today, that's all it will ever mean." She turned away without another word, walking, toward the federal marshals, who were preparing to transport their prisoners to trial. Thomas fell into step beside her, and together they headed toward a future that neither of them could have imagined when he'd pulled her from the frozen lake just days earlier. But as they walked away from the wreckage of Cornelius Vanderbilt's criminal empire, Thomas noticed that Margaret's hand was shaking slightly. The confrontation with her father had cost her more than she was willing to admit, and the real healing was just beginning. "What happens now?" Thomas asked quietly. Margaret was silent for a long moment, watching as federal marshals led her father away in chains. "Now we find out if justice actually exists in this country, or if powerful men always find a way to escape the consequences of their actions." Thomas looked back at the scene of destruction, the burned logging camp, the scattered equipment, the men who died fighting for a criminal's empire. "I think we just proved that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost." Margaret smiled for the first time since he'd known her, and Thomas realized that the frightened girl he'd rescued from Devil's Mirror Lake was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had faced the worst humanity had to offer, and emerged, stronger than before. The real test, however, was still to come. 3 months after the mountain battle that ended Cornelius Vanderbilt's reign of terror in Oregon Territory, the most sensational trial in American frontier history was about to begin in the federal courthouse of Portland. The imposing brick building had been transformed into an armed fortress, with federal marshals stationed at every entrance and sharpshooters positioned on surrounding rooftops. The reason for such extraordinary security sat in the defendant's chair, a man whose wealth and influence had corrupted officials from Washington, D.C. to the Pacific coast. Margaret Vanderbilt stood at the window of her hotel room across the street, watching the crowds gather outside the courthouse. Newspaper reporters from as far away as New York had come to cover what the papers were calling the trial of the century. Street vendors sold pamphlets with lurid illustrations of railroad barons and captive heiresses. Everyone wanted to witness the downfall of one of America's most powerful men. But Margaret felt no satisfaction as she watched the spectacle below. The past 3 months had been a nightmare of depositions, evidence review, and constant threats from Vanderbilt's remaining allies. Twice, assassins had tried to eliminate her before she could testify. The first attempt had been thwarted by Thomas, who'd never left her side since the arrest. The second had been stopped by federal agents, but not before Margaret's hotel room was destroyed by a bomb that nearly killed a chambermaid. Thomas entered the room carrying a breakfast tray, though Margaret doubted she could eat anything. Her stomach had been tied in knots for weeks, knowing that today she would finally face her father in court and reveal the full scope of his crimes to the world. "The prosecutor wants to see us in an hour," Thomas said, setting the tray on a small table. "Final review of your testimony," Margaret nodded absently, still staring out the window. "Do you think it will matter? All the evidence, all the witnesses. Do you think any of it will be enough to convict him?" Thomas studied her face, seeing the doubt and exhaustion that had worn her down over the months of preparation. "Your father made a lot of enemies building his empire. The government wants to make an example of him, show that even the wealthiest men can't place themselves above the law. But he still has friends in Washington, judges he's bought, politicians who owe him favors." Margaret's voice was bitter. "Men like my father don't usually face consequences for their actions." Before Thomas could respond, there was a knock at the door. He answered it to find Marshal Crawford, the federal officer who'd led the operation against Vanderbilt. The marshal's face was grim as he entered the room. "Miss Vanderbilt," Crawford said without preamble, "we have a problem. The defense has filed a last-minute motion claiming that you're mentally incompetent to testify. They're arguing that your years in the asylum have left you unable to distinguish fact from delusion." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. They can't do that. I have medical examinations proving my sanity. They're claiming those examinations were performed by government doctors with a vested interest in the prosecution's case. Judge Morrison is considering allowing an independent psychiatric evaluation. Thomas stepped forward, his dark eyes flashing with anger. How convenient. Delay the trial long enough for Vanderbilt's allies to find a way to make the charges disappear. Crawford nodded grimly. That's exactly what we think they're trying to do, but there's more. The defense is also planning to argue that even if Miss Vanderbilt is competent, her testimony should be excluded because she's an illegitimate child with no legal standing to inherit Vanderbilt property or speak about family business. Margaret sank into a chair, the weight of her father's manipulation crushing down on her once again. Even from his jail cell, Cornelius Vanderbilt was finding ways to control and diminish her. He's trying to erase me completely, make it as if I never existed. Not if I have anything to say about it, said a new voice from the doorway. They turned to see an elderly Lakota woman entering the room, supported by a walking stick and accompanied by a younger Native American man in a business suit. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the woman's face, older and more weathered than in her memories, but unmistakably familiar. "Grandmother?" Margaret whispered. The old woman smiled, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My granddaughter, I thought I would never see you again." Margaret flew to embrace her grandmother, the woman she hadn't seen since her mother's funeral 15 years earlier. For several minutes they held each other and wept, speaking in a mixture of English and Lakota that Thomas recognized from his own tribal connections. Finally, Margaret pulled back and stared at her grandmother in wonder. "How did you find me? How are you here?" The younger man stepped forward. "My name is David Crow Dog. I'm an attorney, and I represent your grandmother and the Lakota Tribal Council. We've been following news of the trial, and we have information that could change everything." Margaret's grandmother reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a bundle of documents wrapped in deerskin. "Your mother never told you the whole truth about her marriage to the white man," she said in accented English. "She was protecting you, but now the truth must be spoken." David Crow Dog took the documents and spread them on the table. "These are records from the Tribal Council, including the original marriage certificate between your mother, Walking Bear Woman, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. The marriage was performed according to Lakota law and later ratified by territorial authorities." Margaret stared at the papers, recognizing her mother's name written in both English and Lakota script. "I don't understand. My father always said they were properly married." "They were," her grandmother said grimly. "But what he never told you was that your mother had been married before, to a Lakota warrior named Standing Wolf. According to our laws, that marriage was never dissolved. When she married the white man, she was still wed to another." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. "That would make my parents' marriage invalid. It would make me legally illegitimate under white law," David Crow Dog confirmed, "which is exactly what your father is planning to argue in court. His lawyers discovered these records and plan to use them to discredit your testimony and your claim to the Vanderbilt inheritance." Thomas was studying the documents with growing understanding. "But there's more to this story, isn't there?" Margaret's grandmother nodded slowly. "Standing Wolf died in battle 3 months before Walking Bear Woman married the white man. She was free to remarry according to our laws. But the territorial authorities never recorded Standing Wolf's death because they didn't recognize Native marriages as legitimate. So my mother's first marriage was valid under tribal law, but not recognized by white authorities," Margaret said, working through the implications. "And her marriage to my father was valid under white law, but the tribal records suggest she was still married to Standing Wolf." "Exactly," David Crowdog said. Your father's lawyers are hoping to create enough legal confusion to invalidate your legitimacy and therefore your testimony, but we have additional evidence that changes everything. He produced another document, this one bearing official territorial seals. This is Standing Wolf's death certificate, filed with territorial authorities 1 week before your parents' marriage. It proves that your mother was legally free to remarry under both tribal and white law. Margaret stared at the certificate, seeing her salvation written in faded ink. Why didn't my mother ever tell me about this? Why keep it secret? Her grandmother's face hardened. Because your father threatened to destroy the evidence if she ever spoke of it. He wanted to keep you under his control by making you believe you had no other family, no other heritage to claim. But Walking Bear Woman was smarter than he knew. She gave copies of all the documents to the tribal council for safekeeping. Marshal Crawford leaned forward, studying the papers with professional interest. This is exactly what we need. Not only does it prove Miss Vanderbilt's legitimacy, but it also provides evidence of her father's pattern of manipulation and fraud. Thomas was watching Margaret's face as she processed this revelation. He could see the mixture of relief and anger warring in her expression. Relief that her legal standing was secure, and fury at discovering yet another layer of her father's deception. There's something else, David Crowdog said quietly. Your grandmother has agreed to testify about your mother's death. She has evidence that it wasn't an accident. Margaret's hands began to shake. What kind of evidence? Her grandmother spoke, slowly, each word carrying the weight of 15 years of silence. I was there that day. Walking Bear Woman had asked me to come to the house because she was afraid. She had discovered papers in your father's office, documents showing he was planning to sell tribal lands using forged signatures from dead chiefs. The old woman paused, gathering strength to continue. Your mother was going to expose him. She had copied the documents and was planning to take them to federal authorities, but your father discovered what she was doing. Margaret felt the world spinning around her as the truth she'd suspected for years was finally confirmed. He killed her. I saw him push her down the stairs, her grandmother said simply. Then he saw me watching from the servants' entrance. He threatened to kill you if I ever spoke of what I had witnessed. For 15 years, I stayed silent to protect you. But now you are strong enough to hear the truth, and he can no longer hurt you. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of this revelation. Margaret's father wasn't just guilty of fraud and corruption. He was a murderer who had killed his own wife to protect his criminal empire. Marshal Crawford was the first to speak. Ma'am, would you be willing to testify to this in court? Margaret's grandmother straightened her shoulders with regal dignity. I have waited 15 years to speak the truth about my daughter's death. Yes, I will testify. David Crowdog gathered the documents carefully. We should get these to the prosecutor immediately. This changes the entire nature of the case, but Thomas was studying Margaret with concern. The revelation about her mother's murder had hit her harder than all the previous discoveries combined. She sat motionless, staring at her hands. Her face, pale and drawn. Margaret, Thomas said gently, are you all right? She looked up at him with eyes that held a lifetime of pain. I always knew, deep down I always knew he killed her. But hoping you're wrong and knowing you're right are very different things. Her grandmother reached out and took Margaret's hand. Your mother died trying to protect our people from your father's greed. Today, you have the chance to finish what she started. You can ensure that justice is finally served. Margaret squeezed her grandmother's hand, drawing strength from the connection to her mother's family and heritage. Then that's what we'll do. For her memory, and for everyone else he's hurt. 2 hours later, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity as the trial of Cornelius Vanderbilt began. Margaret sat in the witness section with Thomas beside her, watching as her father was led to the defendant's table in shackles. He looked older than she remembered, his hair gone completely white and his face gaunt from months in prison. But when his eyes met hers across the courtroom, she saw the same cold calculation that had terrified her as a child. The prosecutor, a brilliant young federal attorney named James Sullivan, rose to address the jury. His opening statement painted a picture of corporate greed and criminal conspiracy that had corrupted officials and stolen millions of acres from native tribes. But it was when he mentioned the murder of Walking Bear Woman that a gasp went through the courtroom. Vanderbilt's defense attorney, a pompous man named Reginald Ashworth, who'd made his career defending wealthy criminals, immediately objected. "Your Honor, there are no charges related to any alleged murder in this case." Judge Morrison, a stern man known for his integrity, studied the prosecution table. "Mr. Sullivan, please clarify the scope of these proceedings." Sullivan stood confidently. "Your Honor, we will be introducing evidence of murder as part of our case regarding Mr. Vanderbilt's pattern of criminal behavior and his efforts to silence witnesses to his fraud." The judge nodded slowly. "I'll allow it, but you'd better be able to connect it directly to the charges at hand." Margaret's grandmother was the first witness called. She walked to the stand with dignity that commanded respect from everyone in the courtroom. When she was sworn in, she spoke the oath in both English and Lakota, a symbolic gesture that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. David Crow Dog served as translator when needed, but Margaret's grandmother spoke primarily in clear, accented English. As she told the story of her daughter's marriage and murder, her testimony was devastating, detailed, consistent, and delivered with the quiet authority of someone speaking absolute truth. When she described watching Cornelius Vanderbilt push his wife down the stairs, the courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Margaret saw several jurors lean forward, their faces grim with concentration. Ashworth's cross-examination was brutal but ineffective. He tried to discredit the old woman's memory, her motivations, and her ability to accurately describe events from 15 years earlier. But Margaret's grandmother remained unshakable, answering each question with calm precision. "Mrs. Walking Bear," Ashworth said during his most aggressive line of questioning, "isn't it true that you've harbored resentment against my client for years because of your daughter's marriage to a white man?" Margaret's grandmother looked at him with the patience of someone addressing a slow child. "I resented him because he murdered my daughter. The color of his skin was never the issue." When Margaret was finally called to testify, she felt as if she were walking through a dream. The courtroom faded away as she focused on telling her story, her childhood imprisonment, her mother's death, her years in the asylum, and her escape. But it was when she described the documents they'd found at the logging camp that her testimony became truly damaging to her father's case. "Miss Vanderbilt," Sullivan asked, "in your opinion, was your father aware that his logging operations were illegal?" "He wasn't just aware of it," Margaret replied clearly. "He planned it. The documents we found included letters in his own handwriting, ordering his men to continue operations despite federal warnings. He knew exactly what he was doing." Ashworth's cross-examination of Margaret was even more vicious than his treatment of her grandmother. He attacked her mental state, her motivations, and her relationship with Thomas. He suggested she was lying, to gain revenge against a father who'd only tried to protect her from her own instability. But Margaret had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. She answered each question calmly and factually, never allowing Ashworth to provoke her into an emotional response that might discredit her testimony. The turning point came when Ashworth made the mistake of suggesting that Margaret's escape from the asylum proved she was dangerous and unstable. "Mr. Ashworth," Margaret said quietly, If you had been locked in a room for 3 years by a man who murdered your mother and stole your inheritance, wouldn't you try to escape too? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Margaret saw several jurors nodding in agreement. Thomas was the final major witness, testifying about the rescue, their discoveries at the logging camp, and the battle with Vanderbilt's hired killers. His military background and obvious integrity made him a compelling witness, and his description of Vanderbilt's willingness to kill his own daughter rather than face justice left the jury visibly shaken. When all the testimony was complete and closing arguments had been made, the jury retired to deliberate. Margaret sat with Thomas and her grandmother in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, waiting for a verdict that would determine not just her father's fate, but the future of justice in America. "Whatever happens," her grandmother said quietly, "your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." Margaret squeezed the old woman's hand. "I hope so. I hope this is enough to honor her memory." 3 hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. As the foreman rose to read the decision, Margaret felt Thomas take her hand. She looked across the courtroom one last time at the man who had shaped her life through fear and violence. Cornelius Vanderbilt stared back at her with eyes that held no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Even now, facing the possibility of execution, he remained the same cold, calculating predator who had murdered her mother and stolen her childhood. But Margaret was no longer the frightened girl he'd tried to control. She was a woman who had survived everything he could inflict and emerged stronger for the experience. Whatever the jury decided, she had already won the most important victory of all. She had reclaimed her own life. The foreman cleared his throat and began to read the verdict that would determine whether justice truly existed in America or whether wealth and power would once again triumph over truth. "We, the jury, find the defendant Cornelius Vanderbilt guilty on all charges of fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and accessory to murder." The words echoed through the packed courtroom like thunder, followed by an explosion of voices as reporters scrambled to be the first to telegraph the news across the country. Margaret felt her knees buckle with relief, and Thomas's steady hand on her shoulder was the only thing that kept her upright. After months of uncertainty, justice had finally prevailed. But even as the courtroom erupted in chaos around her, Margaret found herself watching her father's face. Cornelius Vanderbilt showed no emotion as the verdict was read, no surprise or anger or fear. He simply sat motionless, as if the judgment of 12 ordinary citizens was beneath his notice. It was a final act of arrogance that somehow made the victory feel complete. Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. When the noise finally subsided, he addressed the defendant with the cold formality that the moment demanded. "Cornelius Vanderbilt, you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very foundation of our democratic society. You have corrupted officials, stolen land from indigenous peoples, and murdered your own wife to protect your criminal enterprise. This court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out 30 days from today." The final gavel bang seemed to echo forever. In the sudden silence that followed, Margaret realized she was holding her breath, waiting for some last-minute reprieve or dramatic escape attempt. But none came. Her father was simply led away in shackles, disappearing through a side door as if he were any other condemned criminal. It was over. After 23 years of living under Cornelius Vanderbilt's shadow, Margaret was finally free. The weeks that followed the trial passed in a blur of legal proceedings and media attention. Margaret found herself thrust into a spotlight she neither wanted nor was prepared for. Newspapers across the country declared her a hero of justice, while others painted her as a vengeful daughter who had destroyed her own family. Editorial writers debated whether her actions represented the triumph of truth or the dangerous precedent of children turning against their parents. But Margaret was too busy dealing with the practical consequences of her father's downfall to pay much attention to public opinion. The Vanderbilt empire was collapsing, with federal authorities seizing assets and investigating every business deal Cornelius had made over the past 2 decades. Dozens of his associates were fleeing the country or cutting deals with prosecutors to avoid their own criminal charges. Margaret met with federal attorneys almost daily, helping them untangle the web of corruption her father had woven. The stolen tribal lands would be returned to their rightful owners. The railroad lines built through illegal deals would be transferred to legitimate companies. The millions of dollars hidden in secret accounts would be used to compensate victims of Vanderbilt's crimes. But it was the personal aftermath that proved most challenging for Margaret to navigate. "You could keep some of it, you know," Thomas said one evening as they sat in the parlor of the Portland hotel that had become their temporary home. "The legitimate parts of your father's business. You'd still be one of the wealthiest women in America." Margaret looked up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing, her eyes tired from weeks of meetings and depositions. "I don't want his money, Thomas. Every dollar he made was built on someone else's suffering. Even the money could be used for good. You could fund schools, hospitals, programs to help the people your father hurt." It was a conversation they'd had several times over the past month, and Margaret appreciated Thomas's practical perspective. But she'd made her decision the moment the verdict was read. "I've already spoken with David Crow Dog about establishing a foundation," Margaret said. "We're going to use whatever assets can't be returned directly to fund education and legal aid. For native tribes, let something good grow from all this destruction." Thomas smiled, not surprised by her choice, but proud of her nonetheless. Margaret had inherited her father's intelligence and determination, but none of his selfishness or cruelty. She would use her freedom to heal rather than accumulate more power. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Thomas answered it to find Margaret's grandmother, accompanied by a young Lakota woman Margaret didn't recognize. "Grandmother," Margaret said, rising to embrace the elderly woman. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. I wanted you to meet someone," her grandmother replied, gesturing to her companion. "This is Sarah Hawkfeather. She's a teacher at the new school we're building on the reservation." Sarah stepped forward with a shy smile. "Miss Vanderbilt, I wanted to thank you personally. The foundation you're establishing will allow us to build proper schools and hire qualified teachers. You're giving our children opportunities we never dreamed possible." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude or recognition. For the first time since her ordeal began, she was seeing the positive impact of her choices. Her father's stolen wealth would become education for children who'd been denied opportunities because of his greed. "Please call me Margaret, and I should be thanking you. Teachers like you are the ones who will actually make a difference in those children's lives." As the women talked about plans for the new schools, Thomas found himself studying Margaret's face. The haunted look that had marked her features for months was finally beginning to fade, replaced by something he'd rarely seen in her: genuine happiness. Later that evening, after their guests had departed, Margaret and Thomas walked along the Columbia River as the sun set behind the mountains. The water reflected the orange and pink sky like a mirror, creating a scene of perfect tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of recent months. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Margaret said as they paused to watch a paddle-wheeler making its way downriver. "After all the legal matters are settled and the foundation is established." "What have you decided?" Margaret turned to face him, her blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. "I want to go back to the mountains, not to hide this time, but to live. There's so much about my mother's people that I never learned, so much of my heritage that my father tried to erase. Thomas nodded, understanding her need to reconnect with the parts of herself that had been suppressed for so long. Your grandmother would be happy to teach you. The tribal elders have a lifetime of knowledge to share. I'd like that, but I also want you to come with me. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond simple companionship. Thomas had been Margaret's protector, ally, and friend through the most dangerous period of her life. But what they were discussing now was something different, a partnership based on choice rather than necessity. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked quietly. "You're free now, Margaret. You can go anywhere, do anything. You don't need to tie yourself to a fugitive scout with more enemies than friends." Margaret stepped closer, close enough that he could see the determination in her eyes. "Thomas Crowfeather, you saved my life in every way that matters. You pulled me from a frozen lake, protected me from killers, and helped me find the courage to face my father in court. But more than that, you showed me what real strength looks like. Not the brutal power my father wielded, but the quiet courage of someone who does what's right, regardless of the cost." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm not asking you to. Come with me because I need protection. I'm asking because I want to build something new with someone I trust completely. A life based on healing instead of harm, growth instead of greed." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the guilt and isolation he'd carried for 15 years. Margaret was offering him something he'd never thought possible, a chance at redemption, at building something positive from the wreckage of his past. "The mountains can be hard country for a woman accustomed to civilization," he said, but his tone suggested he was already convinced. Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the water like music. "Thomas, I spent 3 years in an asylum and nearly died in a frozen lake. I think I can handle mountain life." 6 months later, Thomas and Margaret stood on a ridge overlooking a valley in the Cascade Mountains that had become their home. Below them, construction was nearly complete on the first of the new schools funded by the Vanderbilt Foundation. Native children from 3 different tribes would attend classes taught by teachers like Sarah Hawk Feather, learning both traditional knowledge and modern skills that would help them navigate a changing world. Margaret had kept her word about returning to her roots. She'd spent months with her grandmother, learning Lakota customs and language that her father had forbidden her to know. She could now speak fluently with tribal elders, understand the spiritual beliefs her mother had passed down in secret, and participate in ceremonies that connected her to generations of ancestors. But she'd also put her education and business acumen to work in ways that honored her mother's memory. The foundation had grown beyond simple charitable giving to become a force for systemic change, challenging discriminatory laws and supporting native rights across the Western Territories. Thomas had found his own form of redemption in their work together. His military experience and knowledge of government operations proved invaluable in navigating federal bureaucracy and securing funding for tribal programs. More importantly, he was using his skills to protect and serve rather than track and destroy. "The second school should be finished by winter," Margaret said, pointing to another construction site visible in the distance. "And David Crowdog says the territorial legislature is finally considering the voting rights bill." Thomas nodded, pleased by the progress but not surprised. Margaret had inherited her father's relentless drive, but she used it to build rather than exploit. In 6 months, she'd accomplished more positive change than most people managed in a lifetime. "Any word from the marshal about the last of your father's associates?" Thomas asked. "Harrison and 2 others were arrested in California last week. That leaves only Rodriguez unaccounted for, and the federal agents think he's fled to Mexico." Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "My father's network is finally completely dismantled. It had taken months to track down all of Cornelius. Vanderbilt's criminal associates, but one by one they'd been brought to justice. Some had been killed resisting arrest, others had been convicted and imprisoned. The empire of corruption that had seemed invincible was now nothing but a cautionary tale in legal textbooks. As they walked back toward their cabin, Thomas reflected on how much had changed since that December morning when he'd heard a woman's scream echoing across Devil's Mirror Lake. He'd thought he was simply saving a life, but he'd actually set in motion events that transformed both their futures and brought justice to countless victims of greed and corruption. Their cabin was modest, but comfortable, built in a clearing surrounded by pine trees and mountain wildflowers. Margaret had insisted on learning traditional construction techniques from local craftsmen, and the result was a home that blended practical frontier architecture with native design elements. Inside, the walls were decorated with maps showing the locations of all the schools and programs funded by the foundation. Margaret spent hours each evening corresponding with teachers, tribal leaders, and government officials, coordinating efforts to expand educational opportunities throughout the region. But it was the evening routine they'd developed that Thomas treasured most. After dinner, they would sit by the fire while Margaret practiced traditional beadwork that her grandmother had taught her, and Thomas carved wooden toys for children at the new schools. They talked about their plans for the foundation, shared stories from their different backgrounds, and gradually built the kind of partnership that neither had thought possible during their dangerous flight through the mountains. "Thomas," Margaret said one evening as autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, "do you ever regret any of it? The rescue, the fight with my father, everything that followed?" Thomas considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely fugitive living in isolation, haunted by his past mistakes and resigned to a life of solitude. Now he was part of something larger and more meaningful than anything he'd experienced since leaving the army. "I regret that it took so long for justice to catch up with your father," he said finally. "I regret that your mother didn't live to see him brought down, but I don't regret a single moment of our journey together." Margaret smiled and reached for his hand. "Good, because I've been thinking about the future, and I have a proposal for you." Thomas raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the formal tone in her voice. "The foundation is growing beyond what we can manage from here," Margaret continued. "We need a permanent headquarters, a place where we can coordinate programs across multiple territories. I want to build it in Pine Ridge, where this all started. A place where native and white communities can work together instead of fighting each other." It was an ambitious vision, but Thomas had learned never to underestimate Margaret's ability to turn dreams into reality. "What kind of proposal?" he asked. Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly, but her voice was steady. "I'm asking you to be my partner in every sense of the word. Business partner, life partner, equal partner in building. Something that will outlast both of us." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. In all their months together they'd grown closer, but had never spoken directly about the future of their relationship. Margaret was offering him not just love, but a shared purpose that would give meaning to the rest of his life. "Are you asking me to marry you, Margaret Vanderbilt?" Thomas said with a slight smile. "I'm asking Thomas Crow Feather to marry Margaret Walking Bear," she replied, using the Lakota name her grandmother had given her during a recent naming ceremony. "I want to build a family and a legacy based on healing instead of harm." Thomas pulled her into his arms, marveling at how far they'd both traveled from that frozen lake where their story began. "Margaret Walking Bear," he said, testing the name. "I think that's the best proposal I've ever heard." They were married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that blended Lakota and Modoc traditions, with Margaret's grandmother and tribal elders from both communities offering blessings. Federal Marshal Crawford attended as Thomas's best man, representing the unlikely alliance between a former army deserter and the forces of law and order. The wedding was held on the ridge overlooking their valley, with the first completed school, visible in the distance as a symbol of what they'd built together. Margaret wore a traditional dress made by women from her mother's tribe, while Thomas wore ceremonial regalia that honored his Modoc heritage. As they exchanged vows in 3 languages, English, Lakota, and Modoc, Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A chance rescue had become a love story. A fight for survival had become a fight for justice. 2 damaged people had found healing in each other and used their strength to heal others. 5 years later, the Vanderbilt Foundation had established 43 schools across the Western Territories, provided legal aid that had secured voting rights for Native Americans in 6 states, and funded medical clinics that served both tribal and settler communities. Pine Ridge had grown from a rough frontier town into a model community where different cultures worked together rather than fighting each other. Margaret and Thomas stood once again on their favorite ridge, but this time they weren't alone. Their 3-year-old daughter Sarah, named for Margaret's mother, played at their feet while they discussed plans for expanding the Foundation's work into the Midwest. "Do you think she'll understand what we've built here?" Margaret asked. Watching their daughter chase butterflies through the wildflowers, Thomas smiled, remembering a similar conversation they'd had years ago. "She'll understand that her parents fought for justice and won. She'll understand that one person's courage can change the world, especially when they're not fighting alone." Margaret nodded, content with that answer. She'd succeeded in ways her father could never have imagined, not by accumulating wealth and power, but by using her freedom to free others. The Vanderbilt name was now associated with education and justice rather than corruption and greed. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Thomas reflected on the transformation of their lives. He'd started as a fugitive, haunted by past failures, and had become a respected leader, working to build a better future. Margaret had begun as a prisoner of her father's ambition and had become a force for positive change across the entire frontier. Their daughter would grow up in a world shaped by their choices, a world where Native children could attend school without shame, where justice could triumph over wealth, and where love could overcome even the deepest wounds. The rescue at Devil's Mirror Lake had saved more than just Margaret's life. It had saved them both, and through their work together had helped save countless others from the cycle of hatred and exploitation that had defined the frontier for too long. As they walked back toward their cabin with their daughter running ahead, Thomas and Margaret knew that their story was far from over. The Foundation would continue to grow, new challenges would arise, and their family would face whatever the future brought together. But they also knew that they'd already achieved something precious and rare. They'd turned a moment of crisis into a lifetime of purpose, transformed personal healing into public good, and proved that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can change the world. The rescue was complete. The healing had begun, and the future stretched ahead of them, bright, with possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.